For this chapter on global public relations, we are going to expand our worldview from just thinking about public relations as something practiced in the United States to thinking about public relations globally. So, what is global public relations? It is the practice of public relations across national boundaries and within other countries. It's also called international public relations. So, we can think about this in terms of transnational or multinational organizations that conduct country specific or global campaigns. So, a company, I'm going to talk in a minute about Coca-Cola, they might have a campaign that is specific to India or South Africa or France, but they also might have a global campaign that has a common theme, but maybe some tweaks by country. We're also going to talk about we're going to talk about government and tourism offices and how they use global public relations. We're going to talk about public diplomacy, which is how countries influence another nation's policies. And then finally, think about how international organizations seek to influence nations and international public opinion. So just to start off, I just want to talk about a couple of global public relations campaigns. The one on the left is for Lego. It's Lego's Rebuild the World campaign. And a lot of times these campaigns are integrated. They involve public relations and advertising wrapped up in marketing as well. And they're, as I mentioned, global campaigns. And so Lego did a lot of things. I mean, they created advertising content as well. They created a lot of social content, YouTube, for example. But they also did some public relations, some things that I would call more public relations in this campaign. They brought in a spokesperson. Katy Perry was one of the spokespeople that they used. They created some content around her. They also had people sharing what they were building, and if you shared what you built on social, they would donate a set of Legos to kids in a children's hospital. And so these campaigns, they're huge, and they have many different tactics. And again, like I said before, the tactics are often specific to the country or the people that they're trying to target. Another campaign, another multinational company is Coca-Cola, and they have their Create Real Magic campaign. You can see in this photo that the logo is bent, kind of like it's curving around the bottle, and that's a new take on their logo, and they're calling it the Coca-Cola Hug. And so they're doing a lot of things around this Create Real Magic, and they have a campaign running under that talks about how everyone's just one Coke away from another person. They have something pretty cool on this Create Real Magic site. If you go there, is that you could use AI to create art with Coca-Cola. And so, the more that they can engage with consumers or think about like cool ways to engage with consumers. So I like both of these campaigns because people do love to create around these two brands. So let's talk about the state of global public relations at a macro level. Public relations on a global level has expanded with the global economy. And so as companies become more global and are targeting global consumers and they're selling their products all around the world, there is a need for global public relations. Also, the increased trade between nations helps support global public relations as well as worldwide adoption of the internet, which makes it easy to target consumers in many different countries. At a secondary level, public relations is practiced in practically every nation, especially those that are highly industrialized and urban. So when we think about multinational corporations, your Coca-Colas, your Legos, McDonald's, Starbucks, Apple, Amazon, and so on, distribution networks make it possible to sell products worldwide. So Lego can be sold worldwide. We have supply chains for materials that come from other nations. We have employees that may reside in other nations where there's, for Lego, they may have offices. I'm sure they have offices around the world. They have stores around the world. They have factories as well. So you have employees all around the world. Social media can help engage international publics. Like I just said above, that worldwide adoption makes it easy of social media, and the internet makes it easy to connect with consumers. But the practice of public relations will differ between countries, and that's really important to remember, is that even though Lego, Coca-Cola are running global campaigns, they will make sure that what they are doing in specific countries works with the culture of that country. So global public relations is thriving. Why? Because we are in a climate of globalization, as I keep talking about, and globalization has to do with connected international relationships. And this climate is characterized by the following qualities. We have new communication technologies that can connect people. We have 24-hour financial markets. I did fact check this because I was just curious, and I did see that we're kind of on the cusp of having 24-hour financial markets, but because Japan is open, when ours is closed and so on, you can be trading around the clock. There are lower trade barriers between countries. There's a lot more foreign competition now in what were traditionally U.S. markets. And so, if the competition is stiffer, we may need public relations to help our companies stand out. And then shrinking cultural differences. So globalization has increased the importance of global public relations, and we do need cross-cultural communication experts. So let's talk a little bit more about why global public relations is thriving. We do have a global expansion of national corporations. Your book shows you the top multinational corporations in the world, and the top three, I think it's three, and the top five that are U.S. based are Walmart, Amazon, and Apple in that order. In that top five are also, I believe, two other Chinese companies. So the public relations objectives for global public relations campaigns would be growing sales of your products or services, in the international market. Could be lobbying for or against governmental regulations. And so a company might decide to impose some kind of regulation against you, and maybe you want to fight for why that regulation is unfair. And then you may need reputation management when a crisis or an issue occurs. And something may occur to your company in China that doesn't affect you in the United States, but you still, of course, would need to be on top of that. So a lot of challenges with globalization, global expansion. The first one is there's a national populist movement and distrust in business, and that's not just in the United States, but in a lot of places around the world. There's a lot of backlash against expansion of foreign-owned chains. So if McDonald's wants to try to go into a certain country, they may say, we don't want an American company here. We would prefer our people to buy from our business owners, our local business owners. And it's a good thing. One of the challenges that you should show how your corporation contributes to the local economy or community. So that's something that PR can help you with, and that can make people, your business coming in there a little bit more palatable to the locals if you can at least show that you are helping the economy in some way. So a lot of big PR firms have regional offices around the world in all the major cities around the world. And just a final note here is that PR does help with uncertainty or challenges in the global marketplace. When I just mentioned that there are a lot of hubs around the world, I have talked about Edelman before, but this is just a map from their website, so you can see where they have offices. You see, of course, a lot in the United States and Canada, Europe, Asia, quite a few in Asia, handful in South America, Africa, and Australia. So the big PR firms will definitely have a presence around the world. And the reason they want to do this is because if they do want to run a global campaign, or they want to run a campaign in Europe or Asia, they have people on the ground there. And maybe a lot of those people come from those countries. And I'm not saying that just only Americans work in these offices around the world, but they're probably staffed by people who come from that country and understand that culture and know what will work in that culture. Now let's talk about PR industries and practices. So PR emerges more readily in nations that have a multi-party political system, considerable private ownership of business and industry, a large-scale urbanization, and high per capita income levels. So you're more likely to see thriving public relations practices in countries that meet those criteria. Now, your book talks specifically about China. China is not multi-party, it's a communist nation, but it still had explosive growth in public relations. So these are not like hard and fast criteria. There can still be thriving public relations practices in places that don't meet all these criteria. But where is public relations most established? United States, Canada, in the EU, Europe, China, but also growing in Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Thailand, and the UK. And so when you have public relations industry, like when you kind of know you have an established industry or a developing industry, you usually have these 5 qualities, or you meet these 5 qualities. That there is a body of knowledge and a recognition of public relations as an academic subject. So like you could go to a university in, say, Spain and study public relations. If you can't, that just it gives you an indication that public relations probably isn't that developed there. There's an acceptance of public relations as a management function, which is something that we talked about early on. That the practice of public relations has evolved beyond media publicity or media relations, that it's not just getting stories in the news, that public relations is used for more sophisticated practices in that country. There's a greater integration of public relations and marketing. And then there's an existence of professional associations with continuing education. So if there is a Public Relations Society of America there in that country, that's an indicator that it is a thriving public relations. There's a thriving public relations practice there. So this is from your book, just to show you a little bit, really what I just said about where the established PR industries are around the world and where they tend to be more developing. So, of course, as I mentioned, United States, Canada, Argentina, Australia, China, etc. And then where you see it more developing, Mexico and Brazil, over in Chile, over here on our side of the world, and then Russia, India, Saudi Arabia. Looks like a lot of Eastern Europe as well as a few African and Asian countries. So let's talk about NGOs. So NGOs are non-governmental organizations, and they depend on international support for their programs and causes. So here are a few examples. You may have heard of some of these before: Greenpeace, Amnesty International, Doctors Without Borders, or Oxfam. So again, these they're not run by the government, but they are international organizations, and they're often working on international issues. They do need to use public relations to generate support or try to affect some change in government policies or corporate policies. So, that's what they're using public relations for. People do tend to perceive NGOs as more trustworthy or credible than the government or media organizations. And so that's an important point to remember about NGOs. They can partner with companies. That's kind of interesting. So if your company partnered with Greenpeace, for example, you look like a more socially responsible company for supporting Greenpeace's mission, but then Greenpeace can also get some funding from you. So it's like a win-win for both. And NGOs might also partner with a governmental agency on some global issue. There are a number of challenges to practicing public relations internationally, and I think I've mentioned some of these already. You must consider the cultural differences and adapt your approach, branding, and messages. So I just put a little photo here from McDonald's in India. So, their advertising and PR campaigns are not going to look like the ones in the United States. The branding's going to be different. The messaging's going to be different. The name of the restaurant may even be different. They may not use the golden arches, depending on the country. So you should be sensitive to the concerns of globalization. Like I said before, not everybody wants McDonald's in their country. Not everybody wants Walmart. So as you enter a country, the more culturally sensitive you can be to their needs, the better you're going to be able to do business there. So you should develop a cultural literacy about various publics. There were a couple examples in your book, like IKEA deleted women from their catalog in Saudi Arabia just because of the place of women in society. There was a Nike campaign that ran in Japan. It was about discrimination against mixed race athletes. And the Japanese people did not like it, even though that is a problem there. They just felt that was like too sensitive for a U.S. company to be commenting on that issue in Japan. So, you have to tread carefully. I pulled this also from your book, that questions arise as whether a company that supports gender equality in the workplace would continue to do so in countries where conservative religious leaders would be critical of those policies. And so, just the way you do things in the United States is not going to be the way you can do things around the world. So let's talk a little bit more about cultural differences. Of course, your messages should be translated to the native language of the public. It can be tricky in places where people do speak different languages. I mean, here in the United States, of course, most people speak English, but there are a lot of countries where people are moving between several languages in a very small area. You should use native speakers to translate. And of course, it wouldn't be like a word-to-word translate. They need to make sure that the context makes sense for that culture. And so you also need to recognize cultural differences beyond language. And so here's a few that were mentioned, high context cultures and low context cultures. And so here, in non-Western countries, especially in Asian and Arab countries, people tend to be more high context. And what this means is that they are little bit more indirect in their speaking, and so you need to read between the lines. So just because they say the words doesn't mean that that's exactly what they mean. So you have to read between the lines. The meaning is implicit. We live in a low context culture in the United States. Europe is also, for the most part, a low context culture where the meaning is derived from exact words. So, here in the United States, many Americans are very direct in their language, and so that's a low context culture. Hofstede outlined a few other cultural differences. These are kind of, for the most part, on a range, and you can read more about these in your book, but they do have implications for the practice of public relations. One I think is particularly interesting is individualism versus collectivism. And here in the United States, we are an individualistic culture. We believe, work hard and you can have career success. And it's all based on you. But there are other cultures, especially Asian cultures, that are more collectivist, where it's more about the family group, working together and not just individual achievement. So I think that's one that's particularly important. More on cultural differences, you should learn the social customs and the etiquette of interpersonal communication for the cultures that you're working in. So maybe you get a wonderful opportunity to go and work in Japan. You would not be successful acting just like an American with all the Japanese businessmen and women that you would have to do business with. There's a few points that your book makes that are interesting: monochronic cultures and polychronic cultures. And this relates to our attitudes toward time. And in the United States, we live in a monochronic culture where, if something is going to be at 3 p.m., we are expected to show up at 3 p.m. or if something's due at 3 p.m., we're expected to turn it in at 3 p.m. And then there are cultures, and they point out that Africa and Latin America has a lot of these cultures where time doesn't really mean anything. Late's acceptable. I had a friend that taught a class in Curacao, which is just right off of the coast of South America. And she said that students, they wouldn't worry about showing up to class on time because they just had a very different sense of time. In the United States, we tend to be more morning oriented, and so there's nothing wrong with having a breakfast meeting, where in Latin American cultures, and I would say probably some European cultures as well, it's perfectly acceptable to set a dinner meeting for 9 or 10 o'clock. I think you might be aware that people in other countries, or we might eat dinner at 6, they're eating dinner at 10. So it's just very different. You just have to adjust to that. Greetings, Latin America, even in some European countries as well. Hugging and kissing is perfectly acceptable. Here in the United States, that would not be acceptable. In East Asian countries, gift giving is very popular. I've had a lot of Asian students through the years, and I have gotten a lot of lovely gifts from my students, my Asian students, and so that's just part of the culture. Just a couple more. In Japan and Korea, business socializing involves drinking. China, you don't number tables. Like if you were going to have an event and have like table 1, table 2, like it just shows like a rank that's not appreciated. And there's also a lot of numbers that are unlucky numbers, and you wouldn't want to be at certain tables. A book also mentions that you don't say no in Asian cultures. People are unlikely just to say, no, I'm not doing that. They might say something a little bit like that. It'd be very difficult to do. I did learn a fun fact. I did not know this. And now that I'm just thinking of this, I think it's in Japan and maybe Korea, that if you are drinking with somebody who is more senior to you, so you go out and have drinks, that you would turn away from that senior person when you take a sip of your beer or whatever you're drinking. It's just rude, I guess, to take a sip in front of that person who's your superior. So just keep that in mind too. So there's a lot of different media environments out there as well. And as you know, in public relations, we are often trying to get our stories covered by the media. And so how we deal with the media can be different depending on the media system and the culture. So in the United States, you know that our mass media outlets are independently owned. They are not owned by the government or controlled by the government. So they're either independently owned or owned by like a corporate media conglomerate. So we have an independent press, where in other countries that might be government controlled, and sometimes you have to use bribes to get favorable media coverage. So all the interrelated legal, political, economic factors influence the media environments within a country. And then just a final thought here, that most organizations do maintain a social media presence worldwide, but the same platforms aren't preferred across countries. So if you're trying to reach people in China, you may not use Facebook. You may choose to use something else. So you should find out what people like and they use, and what platforms they like and use, and then develop country-specific strategies and localize the content. Sorry, that should say and localize the content. We are often working in difficult business environments, and as I mentioned before, globalization isn't something that's embraced by everybody around the world. That makes our job a little bit harder to do in public relations when we are dealing with companies that are global companies. Proponents say that globalization contributes to widespread economic growth. It helps to circulate ideas, languages, and culture. It's great to just, be all one world. But there are critics out there who say that it destroys local cultures. Again, you think about McDonald's coming in or a Walmart opening up, what that can do to the local culture. It also creates global and retail empires that exploit the environment and put profit over the health and well-being of the people. And so if you go in there and you are just like building plants or whatever in a foreign country, are you destroying their environment just to make a lot of money for your company? And so global companies must strive to be good corporate citizens and take action to improve their business practices, lives, and the environment. So now we're going to shift gears and talk about public diplomacy. Public diplomacy is the process of promoting national interests among the publics of other nations by sharing information about a country. So in a way, it's like country brand building. So we're trying to make, the United States and our actions and our decisions, sometimes these have to deal with military actions, that sort of thing. We're trying to make ourselves look as favorable as possible around the world. Your book mentions Facebook as being a channel that has disseminated a lot of information for public diplomacy purposes. Now, the United States is a major disseminator of information to help citizens and governments around the world understand our actions and policies. So again, if we are, taking some kind of military action against a country, or we're supporting a country in their military action, or not supporting a country for whatever reason, we are putting out information that supports why we are doing what we're doing. We currently have the U.S. Agency for Global Media to put out a lot of this information. They oversee 5 networks. 2 of them that you may have heard of are the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe. Now, this agency evolved from an earlier one called the U.S. Information Agency, USIA, and what they did is focus on U.S. achievements, or like telling the story of U.S. achievements, lifestyles, advantages. They started up some cultural exchange programs and different things like that, so that again, we're telling our story to the world and trying to build goodwill around the world. So a lot of the programs that USIA started continue today, but within the U.S. Agency for Global Media. Other nations' efforts. So, we're doing this, other nations are doing this as well. What are they doing? One of the things that they're doing is working to advance their political objectives. Some of the tactics that they mention that other countries might do in the United States include meeting with policymakers. And so, whether it's senators, Congress people, and other influential leaders, they're trying to have those meetings. They're publishing op-ed pieces and say, the New York Times or other leading newspapers to tell their story, sending out news releases using social media, inviting policymakers to lavish dinners, and probably lots of other events. So your book mentioned Saudi Arabia. They wanted U.S. support for its war in Yemen, and for the U.S. also to support them in their opposition to the Emir of Qatar. And so they were using public diplomacy for these purposes. We also have nations using public diplomacy for commercial and economic interests. And so, sometimes this is about tourism. So we're trying to, brand our country so that people will want to visit there as tourists or invest in the country in some way. One example from your book is that Ireland wanted U.S. companies to do business there, so they made the environment friendly for U.S. businesses, and did a PR campaign to get them to put a business there, put a branch there. They can also influence U.S. governments in other ways that impact the nation's economy, like favorable trade agreements. So, for example, Brazil wanted to reduce tariffs on their ethanol imports to the United States, so they used public diplomacy in order to accomplish that. They might seek to also ease immigration restrictions. So, another example from your book, that South Korea was trying to use public diplomacy with the United States for their high-tech workers, so that their high-tech workers could get work visas to work in the United States. And it could also be funding for national projects, or like maybe there's been a natural disaster and the country needs some aid from the United States. And then finally, with other nations' efforts, they might be trying to build their reputation or have branding objectives. And one example they mention is the BBC and their reporting, and it has a very strong reputation around the world, but it also helps the UK's reputation that is like the face of the United Kingdom. You can also meet with opinion leaders, and often what you're trying to do is win the public's understanding and support for a specific issue that maybe undermines the country's standing in the world. Okay, let's talk about public relations for a foreign government. So you might be hired for a foreign government to work in the United States as a consultant or lobbyist to help them with their issues, with the regulations you would like to have passed, with the favorable treatment you would like to get from the United States. But you need to register with the Department of Justice. We also have PR firms that will work on behalf of non-U.S. governments, and they're often hired by the embassy of that government after open bidding. So what they would do if you were, working in PR for a foreign government, you would gather detailed information about the client country, look at all their past media coverage. You would establish an information bureau that could provide facts or publish statements about the country. You would have appointments with key media people here in the United States and other influential people. So you'd go see them in their place of business, and then you also would invite them to visit your country, to visit the country. And then you would hope from all these efforts that public opinion would change, that there'd be favorable trade legislation passed, that maybe your country would get more foreign aid, more U.S. tourists would come to that country. So one example that's mentioned in your book is Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan's a former Soviet republic, no longer, but it sought to improve its image. And I'm personally really interested in tourism, public relations. And so I think it's fun to think about like rebranding a whole country in order to get tourists to think about it differently. So they wanted to attract foreign investors in the country, probably foreign tourists as well. And so they did run this ad. So, sometimes, of course, there's advertising working with public relations. So they ran this ad. Kazakhstan has another asset besides oil, gas, and minerals: democracy. So, that's sending a very strong message. This is no longer a Soviet, communist republic. This is a democratic nation. And so this ad campaign generated a lot of favorable coverage for them, including 9 short segments on CNN. Your book talks about CNN being a little bit unethical there, but the point being that, you could have a very cool ad campaign and then work your public relations campaign, sort of with that ad campaign. So I have a picture from Kazakhstan, and then from the Tourism Bureau. Kazakhstan, very nice. And that might ring a bell to you with if you've seen any of the Borat movies. And I think they just decided, even though it was very insulting to their culture, that they would just embrace Borat because people could identify Kazakhstan because of that movie, those movies, or that movie, one movie, I guess. There are some ethical issues when you are representing a foreign government or foreign country. So one example mentioned in your book is that Ethiopia hired a PR company called Venable to counteract the negative publicity surrounding the invasion of Tigray, the Tigray region, where 60,000 Ethiopians had fled to Sudan. And, in this process of this invasion, civilians were raped and murdered. So, it's kind of hard to be on the side of Ethiopia there with what they're doing, but a PR firm took on that job. And there was a quote from your book from the Center for Public Integrity that said, regardless of human rights abuses, if you have the cash, it's likely there's a firm happy to smooth out the rough edges and represent your interests in the hallways of the State Department or the corridors of Capitol Hill. And that's really the truth. So we want to ask yourself these questions if you're ever in this situation. Will representing this country adversely reflect on my firm and its other clients? So do you want to take on this country that's had human rights abuses or whatever the situation's been? Is it acceptable to represent a nation whose laws, national or foreign policies, and actions may conflict with the interests of my own country? Can the government officials be persuaded that reforms or changes in policies are the only way to effectively change public opinion and improve its reputation? So instead of just kind of like glossing over the bad behavior, can you actually persuade them to change their behavior, practices, policies? And then how can the officials be convinced that the U.S. media is independent from government control and that they can't expect all their coverage to be favorable if they totally control the flow of news in their own country? So, they hire a PR firm to improve their image in the United States. It may not work here because we can't buy favorable coverage, and we're dealing with uncontrolled media. So if you want to work in global public relations, and I'm hoping that maybe some of you have found this presentation very exciting and are seeing yourself within global public relations, here are some things that you can do to prepare. First of all, get a knowledge of foreign cultures, And then we'll talk in a minute about some of the ways you can do that. Your foreign language skills can be very helpful here as well. While you're in school, you can take courses on international relations, global marketing, strategic public relations planning, foreign languages, again, geography, and cross-cultural communication. You should have a knowledge of international affairs. So, I would read like what's going on. Like when I started looking at Kazakhstan, I could have done a super deep dive on the culture of Kazakhstan, but I stopped myself. So, just have a knowledge of what's going on in the world and, maybe what countries are at odds with other countries, some countries want, what other countries want. So the more you know about international affairs and what's going on in the world, the better. You might do some graduate study. You might do a study abroad. You might do an internship abroad. And there's a lot of campus organizations that are related to other cultures, and maybe you would like to get involved in some of those organizations while you're still a student. Now, once you are out in the working world and looking for a job, and you want to work in global public relations, you might look at a corporation or a nonprofit or a PR firm that has offices or operations around the world. So like I mentioned, Edelman Public Relations, try to get a job with them, or work up to a job where you're working for an international public relations firm. More specifically, you could get jobs in international tourism, international environmental or human rights groups, or other NGOs. A PR firm with offices in multiple countries, like I just mentioned. You could do employee or community relations for a company that has operations in a specific country that maybe you want to work in. You could do government work in the public affairs office for an embassy. Could work for a public relations or lobbying firm in Washington, D.C. that represents foreign corporations or governments. You could become a U.S. Foreign Service Officer that has a specialization in public affairs. And so, there's a lot of opportunities out there. Now, if you're thinking, oh, I'm an American, Edelman will hire me because they're based here in the United States, no problem, or, Apple or Amazon or somebody like that, just keep in mind they are casting a global net for employees. And so, they're looking at employees all over the world for these positions all over the world. And so there's just a lot more competition for those positions. All right, that concludes our discussion of global public relations.